Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, which is How to Be an Effective Spokesperson. My name is Cheryl Welbeck, and I'm the Project Manager for Directors of Health Promotion and Education. Today's webinar is brought to you as part of Technical Assistance and Training under the National Implementation and Dissemination for Chronic Disease Prevention Initiative. I'll go through a couple of housekeeping items before we begin today. For starters, all lines are currently on mute, and to your right, you will see a control panel. Within the control panel, there is an option to send a chat message if you need to. If you run into technical difficulties or have problems hearing during today's broadcast, you can also use the chat or question box. We'd like to hold all questions until the end of today's presentation to make sure that we can cover all of the content for today. Additionally, there are a couple of handouts in the control panel. If you haven't downloaded those already, those may be very helpful tools for you as you are planning communications activities. So we encourage you to download those handouts, and there are 5 total. Today's webinar is part 1 of 2. The 2-part training is supposed to focus on building spokesperson skills and messaging for program success. And today is part 1, so we'll address how to be an effective spokesperson, crafting messages for audiences, and then tips and techniques to use before and after interviewing. Today's speakers, we have 2. The presenters are Lisa Tensuan, who is an Associate Director and Experienced Project Director in Social Marketing and Communications at FHI 360. She has over 14 years of experience on health communication campaigns and projects, focusing on adults and providers, including management, creative development, implementation, formative research, evaluation, and training and technical assistance. Ms. Tensuan is a registered nurse and has worked extensively in a variety of settings, and she currently oversees the FHI 360 Technical Assistance Team on CDC's DCH Communication Support Contract. So basically, they are providing support to approximately 90 currently funded CDC awardees. Our second presenter today is Courtney Thompson, who is a Marketing Communications Officer in Social Marketing Communications at FHI 360. She has over 6 years of experience working on behavior change and health communication, and she provides extensive training, technical assistance, earned media, materials development, and research support for a broad range of federal agencies such as CDC's Division of Community Health, Division of Diabetes Translation, and also Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, their Youth Violence Prevention Program. So I'd like to welcome Lisa and Courtney to today's webinar, and thank you for offering your time and expertise to subawardees on the National Implementation Initiative. Welcome to today's call.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Lisa, who will begin today.
Okay. It's loading.
Cheryl, it looks like it's Lisa's screen, but not GoToWebinar, so we might want to switch that over.
Okay.
Nothing's loading for me.
Okay, we can.
There we go.
Okay, I can drive a little bit if you'd like.
There we go.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. There? All right, there. Can everyone see those slides?
Okay.
Okay. Let me see. I'm not able to drive them, so Cheryl, you're in charge, okay?
Sure, no problem.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. As Cheryl said, my name's Lisa, and I'm joined by Courtney DuPont, and we are both members of the DCH communication team. And as Cheryl said, our job is to help awardees like you leverage the media, communication, and marketing that you do within your community and also grow a healthy movement nationwide. So this training is the first of a 2-part training. Today we will be providing an overview of how to be an effective spokesperson, and then this Thursday, August 20th, we'll be conducting small group practice sessions with those of you who have already signed up to participate in that training, or if there's others of you that want to join, we can certainly perhaps accommodate more people later on. So next slide, please. This is just our disclaimer slide, and you all can read that as you have time, and we can move on to the training objectives. Let's review the learning objectives for today's session. First of all, we would like to define strategic communication and have you understand your role as a spokesperson. We'll talk a little bit about audiences and how to craft messages for each of those audiences, and we'll discuss some techniques and tips for before, during, and after an interview or a presentation. And these will include things like preparing to speak effectively, delivering a strong interview, and responding to challenging questions. And lastly, we're going to share resources at the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. We thought we'd kick off our session today by asking you a question. So this is a poll that Cheryl's loading, and we'd like you to take a minute and answer honestly. The results are anonymous. And we just want to get a pulse on how you feel when it comes to being a spokesperson. So are you nervous? Do you feel like you're, the worst that there is, or not the worst, but also not the best? Or do you feel that you're a pro and completely in control? And take just a second now and answer these, please. You getting some selections in, Cheryl?
We are.
Okay. All right. It looks like we've got a pretty mixed group, and that's great. For those of you that are nervous, you're not alone. And by the end of the webinar, you're going to have tips and tools in your pockets that will boost your confidence and that will help you deliver a great interview. And for those of you who are a little more experienced, I know you'll have some great tips of your own to add as well. And maybe at the end of the discussion today, you'll be able to share some of those tips back with us. So thank you for answering that poll. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we want to offer some context. The Health Impact Pyramid helps demonstrate how our work in community health is grounded in changing the broader context for healthier living. We're all familiar with interventions that are targeted to the individual or the patient level that's shown here at the top of the pyramid. That's things such as one-on-one counseling or brochures addressing a particular issue. The communications task within your community health effort is to reach wider audiences and create a climate that encourages healthy living, builds support for and facilitates program changes, which we sometimes refer to as ground softening, and by increasing awareness and support, lays a foundation for sustainability. So next slide, please. Let's start with the definition of communication. For the purposes of our work today, we're using the word communication interchangeably with media and also with marketing. All are ways to tell your story broadly through outlets that reach key audiences for your community health work. Communication is more than public service announcements, brochures, and presentations. We want to engage, inform, and educate individuals, groups, and communities to have an impact on the knowledge and attitudes and encourage new perspectives and approaches to make healthy living easier. Next slide, please. Communication can also help to change the community context that we just mentioned with the Health Impact Pyramid. We are all looking at ways to improve our choices where we live, learn, work, and play. Communication can generate inspired community conversations. It can soften the ground for those conversations, and it can help show how to make healthy living easier. These efforts are also important to advancing your program work. In fact, communication provides air cover for your ground troops, everyone in your community who are putting your programs into place. Sharing your successes also can support this change. People want to be part of success, and communicating your early wins will generate support for the long haul. And as success is demonstrated, as audiences large and small see the results that come with community-wide healthy changes, there can be a true increase in demand for even more options, for more smoke-free housing or whatever programs are working in your communities. Next slide. So let's begin. The work you're doing deserves to be heard, but the only way your community will hear about it is if you tell them. That's why it's so important for you to be the best spokesperson you can possibly be. On the screen, you see a few examples of media the national organizations have already received, and there's many more. This is just a brief example. In here, you can see the Eastside Health District in the East St. Louis, Illinois, is one of the agencies involved in the National WIC Association's project. And along with 16 other local WIC agencies involved in the project, the Eastside Health District is working to secure healthy food access and prevent chronic disease for community members in their region. The editorial on the left, which was written by the Eastside Health District's program manager and it was featured in the Belleville News-Democrat, outlines the agency's project goals, specifically its efforts to reduce high death rates tied to heart disease, stroke, and diabetes in the East St. Louis community. And on the right, the article from the American Heart Association was published on Heart's blog, which is blog.heart.org, and it was picked up by the Huffington Post. So getting this information communicated in the news builds awareness and community buy-in. As I said earlier, it kind of softens the ground for your work. Through earned media, you can keep your program on people's minds longer, and you can share successes, both large and small. We already know this works in the commercial sector. Big brands like Coke, McDonald's, Nike, they do more than just sell a product. Their media efforts help them build credibility, support, and affinity for their companies with consumers. Health communication efforts should do the same thing. Ideally, people we reach out to should not only see and hear our messages, but also feel that there is something important and larger than a public health education campaign at work. And we want communities to see value in and trust the work that we all do and to understand their role in making healthy living easier for everyone. Next slide, please. So sometimes when you hear the word spokesperson, we automatically think of the person on TV who's representing a company or an organization, the person who always gets tapped to do media interviews. But in reality, everyone is a spokesperson. Anytime you're talking about your program, meeting with stakeholders, or giving a presentation, you're the spokesperson. Everyone needs to be able to talk about what they do and why it matters. So our goal here today is to train you to talk articulately to the media, primarily, but also to talk with stakeholders, partners, and influencers about why they need to change the environment where we live, learn, work, and play. And remember, we not only need to be able to talk about our programs, we need to do it strategically. We need to make sure we recognize our audience and develop messages that advance our programmatic efforts. Next slide. So to get started, there's some key things to ask yourself for each messaging opportunity. First off, what is your objective? Second, who is your audience or audiences? And more specifically, what audience do you reach through a local TV station, neighborhood newspaper, or other channel? How you reach them will likely differ. Next, what does your audience want, or what do they value? Fourth, what is it that you want your audience to know or do? And finally, who is the best person to carry this message to your audience? Next slide. I'm going to just touch on a few things about audience. First off, know that the general public really is not an audience. You need to be a little more specific than that. Who within the residents of your community are you trying to reach? The more you can narrow the focus, the more you can hone your messages and delivery. So is it parents, or is it parents of elementary age kids, infants or toddlers? Be careful not to go overboard, but have in mind who the bullseye is of your target population. And we've listed on this slide some frequently considered audiences. Media is usually not a primary audience, but they're a channel to reach your audience. After you've clearly identified who your audiences are, craft your message so it has meaning to them. What are their needs and how are you addressing them? What benefits would they see from what you're offering? Be sure to know this before suggesting what you want them to know or do. Next slide. One of the handouts that you'll see from today's session is a worksheet to help you think through who your audiences are and begin considering language that might resonate with them. We'll be discussing this again towards the end of today's presentation. This will be a form of homework, quote unquote, for those of you that are attending the in-depth spokesperson training with us on August 20th. Next slide, please. So who are your messengers? Who among your organization or your partners is best to talk with, let's say, moms about healthy food options? Is it you? Maybe not. Or maybe it is. Maybe it is you who talks about the science and solution, and then you bring in a community mom who talks about her own experiences with trying to feed healthy food to her 4 children on a limited budget. You all know your situation and your community best to know what's needed. Some national data reaffirms what we know. Localized is better. Local health departments, local organizations, and local medical or health groups are the most trusted by public audiences for health information. This means that when national reports and data come out, you have an opportunity to interpret what this means locally and have it resonate. Next slide, please. Now for the research part of today's webinar. To help you and others effectively tell the story about the great work happening in communities nationwide, the Division of Community Health has conducted message testing and audience research. I want to share just a few findings that might apply to some of your top target populations. We conducted this message testing with Caucasians, Hispanics, and African Americans, and across these groups, they shared many of the same attitudes. Next slide, please. Many felt being healthy was not typically easy, and that the barriers to healthy living included affordability, lack of access, lack of knowledge, and a busy modern life. They also believed improving access to opportunities for healthier living was positive, but felt that freedom to choose was important too. Keep this in mind when you're developing and framing your messages. Lastly, across groups, respondents associated healthy and organic foods with foods from Whole Foods or other specialty grocers. This association led to a belief that healthy foods might be more expensive. This could be a perceived barrier for some and should be taken into consideration whenever you're developing messages. When looking at the, next slide please. When looking at the message testing findings segmented by race and ethnicity, some differences in attitude and beliefs were identified. Caucasians had the greatest concerns about government overreach and the most questions about government spending. Hispanics generally were more enthusiastic about community efforts and expressed some belief that cultural eating habits were a barrier to healthy living. Next slide. African Americans also felt their cultural eating habits were a barrier to healthy living. They also were the most vocal and frustrated around access to healthy living in their communities and concerned about a variety of social problems. Lastly, African American groups were more than others questioned the implementation and the sustainability of community health efforts. Next slide. So before we learn how to effectively deliver your message, you first need to craft your message. Today, we're going to explore a method for developing values-based messages for a broader public, as well as using the values-based messages to build a foundation for your specific audiences. Next slide. These messages can help you align your work and your programs with audience values and priorities, kind of meet them where they are. Effective messages can also help you avoid the us versus them messaging, as well as stigmatization. And lastly, effective messages can describe any program or service in detail or be used to talk about the overall initiative work. Your messages can be used in talking points, print materials, presentations, media releases, and in many more ways. Next slide, please. While your message may remain consistent, bear in mind that different kinds of media opportunities mean that you can deliver your message in different ways. If you're being asked to give a soundbite for local news, you want to take that precious time to grab the viewer's attention. If, however, you've been invited to do a 30-minute overview on a local talk radio show, you'll have a chance to take a deeper dive into shared audience values and stories. Next slide. Regardless of the kind of media opportunity presented to you, your audience will want to hear proof that your issue and your solutions are important and worthy of their attention. Proof can come in the form of anecdotal stories and also from quantitative data points. To make those data points more salient to audiences, consider using a technique like social math. An example is in the box in this slide, and I'll read this to you. The tobacco industry spends more money promoting smoking in a week than the federal government spends on preventing smoking in a year. So that's just an example. Next slide, please. When the opportunity permits, it's helpful to include a value statement in your message. A value statement simply answers the question, what kind of world or community do we want to live in? And the answer is based on a value or values that would be indisputable to your audiences, no matter what their personal priorities are. Values are the big dream that you and your audience can agree on, no matter how your audience may feel about your issues or your programs. Things like, we all need access to healthy food, or everyone needs access to health care. Next slide, please. In this particular example, we start from a place of agreement, that shared value represented in the first sentence, and then we jump into the problem and why it matters. The message shares data and uses social math to compare the number of children impacted to the number of classrooms it would represent, and this gives your audience a sense of the size of the problem. Finally, at the end of this example, a solution is offered, as well as the next steps that an audience might be asked to take. And all of this is done in simple, straightforward language. Next slide, please. When developing a message, we want to start by specifying the problem. Here, we're getting the audience's attention with a fact or a real example. Then we want to illustrate the current landscape and explain why the problem matters by personalizing or humanizing the issue. In either of these first two message components, you may find it useful to add a value statement, a sentence that answers that question. What kind of world do we want to live in? Next, we provide that sense of hope by describing the solution, and this is very important. Always remember to provide a sense of hope with your message and make it achievable. And lastly, we need to end strong by defining what the individuals or groups should do. Next slide. This message framework worksheet that's up on this slide right now is available as one of the handouts today. And for those of you that are participating in the Thursday practice sessions, we would like you to spend some time completing your worksheet before we meet again. And this is what we'll use to build off for the practice media that's taking place on Thursday. And it really aligns very nicely with some of those examples I just gave that you can go back and take a look at. So with that, we would like to jump into the meat of this presentation. And I would like to hand this over to my colleague, Courtney DuPont.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so like Lisa said, let's jump into some of those tips and techniques for before, during, and after your interview. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of these tips and techniques, they really emphasize interview skills that can be used for media, but they can really also apply to presentations and really any other type of speaking opportunity. Okay, next slide. All right, first off, the 4 Bs. So we're going to be referring back to these 4 principles throughout this training. And if you only take away 4 quick tips for how to be an effective spokesperson, make it these 4 on the screen right now. So first, be prepared. Being prepared, this means practicing, getting ready with talking points and messages, and prepping for those tough questions. Second, be quotable. And this may be easier to understand when thinking about speaking to the media, but even in presentations, people are going to remember that something quick and clear and focused. Number 3, be an educator. This really may be our greatest opportunity as a spokesperson because we know from research that many audiences don't know about our programs, and this is really our opportunity to share them. And finally, be in control. You probably have heard the phrase, stay on message. That's what it means to be in control. So sometimes tough questions or nerves can get the better of us, but we can learn tips and tricks to make sure we're always in charge of the interview. All right, next slide. So a little bit about roles during an interview. So your role. First of all, have the confidence knowing that you're the expert and the reporter is interviewing you because they want to learn something and you're that best person to teach them. You're also there to deliver your message. Again, you've got unique information to give and you're that best person to deliver it. And this is a really important one. You get to set the ground rules in an interview. If for some reason the reporter gets off track, you're the one that can bring them back to your message. And you can do that with some of the tips and techniques that we're going to cover in just a little bit. And now for the reporter's role, their job is to provide a story of value for their audience. They want to make the story as interesting as possible. Sometimes people think that means creating drama with tough questions, but I'm going to go ahead and say that's the exception and not the rule. Most reporters are really not out to get you or trip you up. We can't always avoid those tough questions being asked, but using some of the tips and techniques that we'll talk about soon is really going to help you deliver those right answers. And I know we've talked about the reporter's role and your role, but I also want to point out that the audience has a role as well. Their job is to receive your message and ask questions as needed. All right, next slide. So before you even agree to do an interview or some sort of speaking engagement, consider whether it will support your overall strategy. So for example, if you want your community to know that a large company for apartment rentals, for example, has decided to go smoke-free, an interview on talk radio might be the way to go. But whether you should book the interview depends on the show. So if it's a radio show focused on healthy living, that show is going to be a great fit. But conversely, if the host of the radio show has a history of disagreeing with the kind of program you want to discuss, that show is not going to be a good fit. So, it's okay to not take that interview. So if you decide to do the interview or speaking engagement, gather as much background as possible about the reporter, the outlet, and the audience. And you want to consider who in your organization will be the best person to deliver that message. All right, next slide. So before you speak, so once you've agreed to an opportunity, like I said, consider who the best person in your organization is to deliver that message. And if you've accepted the opportunity, a big part of getting rid of nerves before public speaking is the preparation you do before the event. Second up here, know your messages and your audiences. It's important to identify and know your audience so that messages can be tailored and will resonate with them. And this is another important point. Know your messages rather than memorizing them. Repeating something verbatim, it can often come across as disingenuous, and you run the risk of tripping up on one word and losing your train of thought. It's also important to gather relevant facts. This again goes back to knowing your who your audience is and tailoring your interview or your presentation with information that's going to be most relevant to them. So for example, if you want to talk about a workplace wellness program, the employer audience might care most about return on investment. So you'd want to collect data around reduced insurance rates. All right, next up is anticipating questions. So before your presentation or interview, think about what questions might come up. And a very important part of anticipating questions is not just thinking about the standard questions, but also those really hard ones. So how do your opponents feel about your work? What contentious questions might they ask? When you prepare ahead of time for these tough questions, you can have that strong answer ready and respond really confidently. And this last one that we have up here, this is very important. Practice, practice, practice. Talk out loud, practice at home, in front of a mirror, in front of friends or family or coworkers. Practice is how you're really going to know your messages and answers and come across as that trusted messenger. All right, next slide. So preparing to speak, here's a brief timeline for the days leading up to the interview. And I'm gonna put a quick caveat in here. Sometimes you might not have this much time to prepare. We completely understand that. Reporters are oftentimes on deadlines, but these are things, if you do have some time before a presentation or before a big interview, some steps you can do to get ready. So about 2 days ahead of time, review your messages and your talking points. consider what takeaway feeling you want your audience to have. And I want to make it a point that it's okay to want your audience, or it's okay to want to leave your audience with a feeling. You could want them to feel energized or take action on a particular program. We could want them to feel safe in their community, or we could want them to feel happy they live there. Also, you want to be comfortable, so choose professional and comfortable clothes and shoes. About a day before, make sure you keep practicing. If you're nervous, take some deep breaths. On the day of the interview, remember, nerves are completely normal. Take some time alone to stretch and breathe deeply, and remember to drink water. And during the interview, stay positive, energetic, and calm. Smile if the subject matter allows, and don't forget to breathe. All right, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to discuss how to be an effective spokesperson and provide you with some tips and techniques to ensure that success. And we'd like to start this section with a fact that many of you might not be aware of. So this is from the University of Nebraska-Omaha from research in 2012. Their research confirmed that people cite their fear of public speaking more often than any other fear, including death. So in other words, being nervous is completely normal. So do not think you're alone in that. All right, next slide. Okay, so like Lisa went over, we've developed some great messages. Now here are some tips for delivering them. First off, a smart rule of thumb is to begin and end with your most important message. You really want it to be that first thing people hear and the last thing they take away after an interview. Next, you want to repeat your message when you can, but make sure you're not saying the same thing over and over again with the exact same phrasing. And these next three items are a few techniques that we're going to go over in more detail shortly. Bridging is a way to bring the discussion back to your message if needed. And headlining and hooking are both audible cues that will get your audience to listen more closely to what you're going to say next. All right, next slide. So next we're going to go over some do's and don'ts. So do look at the interviewer. I know many of you have probably seen some of those interviews on TV where someone steals a glance at the camera and it looks a little bit awkward. Resist that urge. Just focus on the reporter the same as you would as if you were having a natural conversation. The only time that you would ever need to look at the camera is during something called a satellite interview, something like what you might see on CNN or MSNBC when they have people joining in from remote locations. Next, really in this age of smartphones and other technology, remember that everything you say could be on the record. And anyone with a smartphone has the ability to not only record your interview, but also record before or after the interview. So be careful of what you're saying. So not just during the interview, but before and after too. Third, slow down. We have a tendency to talk really fast when we're nervous. And this is another place where practice is going to really come in handy. So ask friends, family, or coworkers if you're speaking too fast. It might not feel normal for you to slow down at first, but it's really going to come across perfectly natural to your audience. Lastly, always stay positive, friendly, and professional. Having a positive attitude really comes across in your speech and tone. Next slide. So do know when to stop talking. I don't know about you, but there have been times when I've started answering a question and then I've kind of just kept going and going and going, and then somewhere in there I think in my head, why am I still talking and how do I wrap this up? By practicing ahead of time and knowing your message, you're going to be able to stay on track and still be succinct. And another thing kind of along those same lines is taking a moment. You might feel pressure to answer right away, but it's completely okay to take a pause and think about what you're going to say first. That pause comes across completely natural, even if it might feel a little odd at first to do it. And during interviews, especially off-camera interviews, it's okay to have notes, things like key talking points or statistics right there in front of you. You don't want to be reading off the paper, but sometimes it's helpful to be able to glance down and be reminded of those key points or numbers that might be hard to keep straight. All right, next slide. All right, so this is another, well, this is our first quick quiz, actually, and I think we'll do this one as a polling question. So, which of these do's doesn't belong here? So first, look at your audience while you're talking. Wait until the mic is off to say things off the record, or take a moment before answering a question. So which do doesn't belong? We'll give everybody a minute. Cheryl, do we have a good amount of answers in?
I think we do.
Okay, all right, let's see those results. All right, yes, overwhelmingly, wait until the mic is off to say things off the record. Okay, next slide. Yes, that's the answer. Okay, so a few don'ts. The first one we recommend is to avoid using acronyms or technical jargon. It can really be a big turnoff for a listener when they don't know what you're saying, and it can sometimes lead to misunderstanding or confusion. And also, don't be negative about the opposition and don't answer hypothetical questions. Hypothetical questions can often take you off message, which can lead to your information being taken out of context. So when an interview might get cut down to a 30-second soundbite or something like that, you don't want to have that time filled with hypothetical answers. And I'm going to share some tips in just a minute for handling tough questions and some techniques you can use to stay or to get back on message. Next slide. So another recommendation we have is to not repeat something you disagree with in your answer. For example, the question here is, it sounds like you want to take away someone's right to drink whatever they choose with their lunch. Isn't that the government assuming too much control? So in the not so good answer, the spokesperson here says, this isn't about the government assuming too much control, it's about blah, 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 blah. So now, not only did that phrase, the government assuming too much control, come up in the question, the listener is hearing it for a second time in the answer. So a better way to answer that question would be to start with your positive key message, something like, we're actually making more drink options available to people, yada, yada, yada. All right, next. So don't guess. So you're not expected to know every statistic that's out there about the work you're doing. If you don't know the answer, don't guess. If it's a print interview or a presentation or a meeting, you could say, I'm not certain of the answer, but I'll get it for you and follow up. And make sure that you do follow up. If it's a live TV or radio interview, you can use it as an opportunity to put in a statistic that you do know. Like the example here, you could say something like, you know what, I'm not certain about that, but what I can say for certain is that more than 40,000 adults die each year in the United States from secondhand smoke, as an example. Or, again, you could use it as an opportunity to go back to your key message. All right, next slide. So if you're asked tough questions or questions that stray off topic, you can use one of the 3 techniques we mentioned earlier, bridging, headlining, and hooking, to bring the conversation back to your message and keep the audience listening. So we're going to go over those now and provide some examples. So next slide. So bridging is our first one. Bridging is a way to acknowledge the question that's been asked and then steer the conversation back to your key messages. In general, we have this social construct, this idea that when you're asked a question, you answer it. For example, if someone asks my name, I automatically say Courtney. But in a meeting or presentation, you don't always have to answer every question you're asked, especially when they're off topic. And you can use one of the many phrases, including the examples above, to acknowledge the question that was asked and then bridge to your key messages. So on the next slide, let's look at an example of bridging. So this is a tough question. If someone doesn't like smoke and their neighbors in the apartment below are smokers, shouldn't they just move? So a good answer would be to use the phrase, you know what, another way to look at this is, and then move back to your key message. So, so the answer could be something like, you know what, another way to look at this is that every family has the right to live free from harmful secondhand smoke. Many people, especially families and the elderly who are low income, don't have a lot of options for where to live. Okay, next slide. So next is headlining. Sometimes people also call this highlighting. This sets up your answer with a listen up phrase. And these phrases are audible cues for your audience that something important is coming up next. So we'll have an example on the next slide. So let's take a look at this one. So the question is, what do you say to people who think funding for anti-smoking policies is a misuse of dollars that could be better spent in other ways? And a good, strong answer using headlining would be, the key is that prevention is a great investment. Prevention funding is one of the most significant cost controls in healthcare we can make. For every dollar we spend on prevention, we see a 5-to-1 return on investment in just 5 years. Here we use a headlining phrase to turn a negative implication into a positive message. All right, next, this last one is hooking. So hooking is a way to share more information than was asked by hooking a series of related points together. So we'll show you an example of that. So the question is here, you're calling for workplace wellness programs, but is there any real value to them for businesses? An example of a good answer would be, well, to answer your question first, our partnering companies understand that every dollar a workplace spends on wellness programs saves about $3.27 in medical costs. Second, a healthier workforce means less absenteeism and greater productivity. And then third, you can go on from there. And then again, hooking really allows us to offer a succinct list of positive attributes. All right, next quick quiz. And I think Cheryl will bring this one up in a poll. So of the two choices, which is the better way to start an answer to a question? Is it the first one, I'd have to disagree, and let me tell you why? Or the second one, you know what, that's a good question, and another way to look at this is, so we'll give everybody a couple seconds to answer. All right. You guys are correct. The correct answer here is B, nice job. This is an example of bridging, like we just talked about. Here again, you are acknowledging the question being asked and then using a bridging phrase to move the conversation back on topic. Thank you, Cheryl. All right, we've got our next quiz. So again, of these two choices that are up here on the screen, which is the better way to start an answer to a question? Is it the first one? Your last comment is particularly important because, or the second option, you know what, I'm not sure you understood what I meant, let me clarify. All right, 100%, everybody is right. You guys are right. The correct answer here is A, your last comment is particularly important because, and this is using a headlining phrase like this really clues people into the fact that you're about to say something important and it gets them to listen up. Okay, and we have one more, last quiz. Which of these two choices, again, which of these two choices is the better way to start an answer? There are a few examples I can share with you. First, or the possibilities are endless. Let me tell you all of them. All right, yes. So the correct answer here is A. There are a few examples, and I can share with you first. As much as we often feel like the possibilities are endless and we want to say them all, using that hooking phrase can really give you the opportunity to organize your information logically and potentially share more information than you might have been able to get in originally. All right, next slide. Okay, so we've been focusing on your message and how to talk about your work, but the truth is you, as a spokesperson, make as much of an impression, if not more of an impression, as your words do. So let's move into a little bit about on-camera interviews and presentations. So studies show that we pay significant attention to nonverbal cues like body language and vocal tone. Next slide. Here are a few body language tips. So first off, face your interviewer. We also want you to stand still or sit up straight. I want you to remember it's okay to gesture. That's a completely natural part of communication, but just make sure you don't do it too much or too big because it could be distracting. And here is one particularly important tip. If the subject matter allows, keep smiling. Smile on camera and in person, and even smile for a radio or a newspaper interview. Smiling actually comes across in your tone, and it can add authenticity when you're talking about the successes of your program. Next slide. Here are a few tips regarding appearance, and I should say that most of these apply to on-camera interviews, but some, like fabric choice and accessories, would apply to an in-person speaking engagement as well. So first off, wear natural colors like gray, beige, and pastels. Black and white can oftentimes be a little harsh for cameras. And you also don't want to wear green if you're going to be in the studio, as many studios film with green screens behind the anchors or interviewees, and you would become see-through in that case. We also recommend avoiding stripes and complex patterns. This can be distracting on camera, and really the same goes for shiny fabrics. So we would say choose fabrics that are made of natural fibers like cotton. They are also less likely to show signs of sweat, which is nice. Also for men and women, if you're wearing a suit jacket that goes past your hips and you're sitting down, pull that down so that you're sitting on the end of your jacket, and this is going to really give you clean lines and keep that suit from bunching up during the interview. Next, choose simple jewelry and accessories. You don't want to wear a lot of bracelets or a really heavy watch or something that's going to jangle as you move your hands. And lastly, everyone should wear makeup for an on-camera interview, even men, and that is due to the wonderful invention of high-definition television. So we would recommend it. If they offer it, take it. And next slide. Okay, so just to recap some of the things that we talked about today. First of all, learn about your audience. You want to tailor your presentation or remarks with information that will be most relevant to them, and also learn about your interviewer ahead of time if possible. During the interview, provide information on upcoming plans or events. This will encourage the outlet to circle back with you for future updates or interviews, and that's really more coverage for your program. Stay hydrated. Don't underestimate the power of water to keep your throat clear. And it should be self-evident, but we should never lie or stretch the truth, but I mean, that always bears repeating. Stay upbeat, positive, and passionate. Human beings are really inspired by other people's passion, and if you're not passionate about your program, then nobody else can be expected to be passionate about it either. Remember that everything is on the record. The mic is always on for interviews, presentations, and even meetings too. And say thank you and follow up with your host or audience after a presentation, and also address any outstanding questions. And remember the 4 B's: be prepared, be quotable, be an educator, and be in control. And also be confident. Remember that you're the expert and you know your information, and now you also have a lot of tools and techniques to help you deliver an excellent interview. Okay, next slide. So we have time for some questions. So please let us know. I think we can do, Cheryl, let us know, should participants chat their questions and we can answer them, or are they able to open phone lines?
Sure. There are actually 2 options for asking a question to the presenters today. You can either type your question into the chat box or the question box, or if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute your line and you can simply ask your question. So if you do have a question, now would be the time to go ahead and either type your question in the question box, or if you want, you can raise your hand, and we're happy to unmute your line if you'd like to ask your question live on today's call. So Courtney and Lisa, while we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions, I just wanted to say these tips are very specific and will be very useful, I imagine, moving forward. Thank you for today's presentation. It looks like a lot of research went into the section on audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've actually done, the Division of Community Health did some focus groups, and that information is actually on the Tactic portal, Cheryl.
Okay.
Under the audience, formative research and audience webinar that was conducted. Oh boy, they all kind of run together in my head, maybe about 3 months ago. Mm-hmm. Courtney, do you remember when that one was?
Yeah, I think that was around the time.
Okay. So that's actually up on the Tactic portal, and there's more research up there on the specific audiences.
Okay.
And that is, that is one key point to take home today, that your messages, the messages that are developed, they're going to vary by audience. So always, always, always go back to that starting point of who is the audience, who is the target audience that I'm trying to reach, and what do I really want to say to them, and what's the call to action. So kind of really thinking about that, because how you tailor that message and deliver it is going to be different than how you would tailor and deliver for a different audience. So that's one takeaway that we want everyone to leave here today with as it relates to audience and messaging.
Okay. Looks like we do have a question. Actually, a couple of people have asked if the presentation will be made available for online viewing later on, and if there will be a recording of today's presentation. Today's presentation has been recorded, and we will provide a link to both the slide deck and also to the recorded presentation for later use if you want to go back and refer to some of the great tips that were provided in today's presentation. So Lisa or Courtney, in thinking about who, I know that you said almost anyone in an organization can be the spokesperson. For every contact you have or opportunities where you have to speak about your program, that almost anyone could be a spokesperson. But in considering who might be a spokesperson for a television interview or radio interview, what kind of consideration should be made there?
Well, Lisa, I'll start off, and then if you want to add anything, I think the main thing, again, is really looking at your audience and figuring out who is going to be that trusted messenger. So it's not only about who might be the most poised on TV, it's also who's going to come across as that trusted messenger. And I mean, and that's really something important, and I want to drive that one home, because it might not always be the person that you think it is. It's really who's going to resonate best with that audience that you're trying to reach. So I would consider that, and also their comfort level on different either radio or TV when thinking about who should be the best spokesperson.
I would agree, Courtney. Nothing to add to that, Cheryl.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, or anybody on the line? Anybody raising hands?
Okay, if anyone does have a question, please feel free to type it in the question box, or if you'd like to raise your hand. Last opportunity for questions. If not,
I'm not sure. Oh, I'm sure. I was just going to say, I was going through the participant list. It looks like Gail Crane might have an unanswered question.
Okay, let me see here.
Gail, I certainly don't mean to call you out in case you accidentally press that button, but if you do have a question, I think Cheryl could either unmute your line or you could chat it.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm pulling, let me see. Okay, Gail, I've actually unmuted your question. I mean, your line. Did you have a question that we missed, perhaps? Okay, we'll circle back to Gail. There is a question in the question box. This question says, if gesturing doesn't feel natural, what should a person do with their hands?
So I think it depends on what the setting is. If you're at a podium, you can feel free to kind of hold on to the edges, like the edges of the podium. You don't want to like white knuckle it. We don't want you to, because that can, but just kind of keep them still where they're not going to be in an awkward position. If you're doing an interview, you can just keep them in your lap, kind of low, so they're off camera, so nobody really sees that. And if you're standing, again, you can kind of just place your hands together in front of you, like clasped a little bit, but not kind of scrunching them together or holding them tightly. Lisa, do you any other recommendations for that?
Nope, those were good.
Okay, and we do have one more question coming in. I'm going to unmute the line. This is Jacina Wise. Okay, Jacina, your line is unmuted. Please feel free to ask your question. Hi, Jacina, can you hear us okay? We're not hearing you at all. Okay, it looks like there might be an audio issue. Let me see if I can get her to type her question in.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, well, as we're wrapping up, maybe, Cheryl, we could go to the handout slide just so we can go over those, and then we can certainly answer any last questions.
Okay.
So I know we're just coming up to the top of the hour.
Okay.
So before we end, we just wanted to share a couple resources with you. And on the next slide, it should be the list of handouts that are available for download. You should also be able to see those in a pod on the right side of your screen, kind of in the middle. You'll notice that the first one that we have on our list is a spokesperson pocket card. This is kind of like a handy little sheet that you have with some of the tips and techniques we talked about. That one we can share with you as a follow-up. So anybody who joined on the webinar today, we can send that out as an email. Everything else that's on the list is here ready to download. So we've got 2 how-to guides, being an effective spokesperson, which is a summary of a lot of what we talked about today. We also have a how-to guide for responding to media requests. We have also kind of along the media request line, we have a media intake sheet handout. So when you do get media requests, that's kind of a worksheet that you can use so you can plan everything out, ask the right questions to the reporter or the interviewer, and have that handy. And 2 worksheets that Lisa mentioned earlier. For those who have signed up for the Thursday in-depth practice sessions, we would ask you to please complete the audience worksheet and the message framework worksheet prior to your scheduled practice time. We're going to use that information that you develop in these worksheets as a starting point for those training sessions. And I also just want to say thank you to everybody who has signed up for those in-depth practice sessions. We are going to finalize that schedule, and then we're going to be in touch with you just to confirm your date and time to make sure we all are on the same page with that information. So you'll get that follow-up in the next day or so. So Cheryl, were there any other questions?
Yes. Okay. It looks like Ms. Wise has posted her question in the chat box, and the question is it ever better to use a translator when presenting in person, even if there is a person available who would not need the translator, but is not as knowledgeable?
And I'm assuming translator, like a language translator?
I think that's what we're talking about.
Okay. So the question, let me just make sure that I heard that correctly. Is it okay to use a translator if the person does not actually need it? Sorry, I just want to get that.
And yes, she did clarify Spanish translator. So is it ever better to use a translator when presenting, even if there's not a person available who would not need the translator, but is not as knowledgeable?
You know what? This is actually a very interesting. It's a very interesting question, because I was just talking about this with someone last week, where they wanted to be really culturally sensitive for their presentation, and during the presentation they wanted to have somebody presenting in English and then simultaneously it be translated into Spanish and have the same things be translated into Spanish. This is just anecdotal, but what they found was with the Spanish, when they were translating, it wasn't translating exactly correct. And so the people who were presenting in English, they could tell that the Spanish was off, and there was this whole back and forth between the translators and the presenters, and it got to be a little complicated. So I would really think about that ahead of time during a presentation. I think it's always important to have, if you have audiences with different languages that you're presenting to, I think it's always important to have any of your materials both in the languages of your audiences. Lisa, do you have anything to add about the presenting part, though? I think that can sometimes get a little tricky.
Yeah, I think it can too. Obviously, if there's people in the audience that are Spanish speakers that do not speak English, then I think the benefits outweigh the risk, but you do have to be very careful at who you have translating for you. And like Courtney said, a lot of times there are, things don't translate exactly between English and Spanish, so it can be different messages and different points can come across. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's kind of the general direction we would give.
Mm-hmm. And one thing, so it's just like, for example, I think the question was about Spanish translation. That might be a factor when you're thinking about who that best spokesperson is. So if they're speaking, for example, to a crowd and they're speaking in English, and then somebody asks a question in Spanish and they can answer in Spanish or understand, that is the person, that bilingual person might be the one that you want, because they can resonate with everybody in the audience. So that might be something to consider.
Okay. I think that looks like the last question that we've had for today. And we are actually a little over time. But thank you, everyone, for your time this afternoon, for participating in today's webinar. And Lisa and Courtney, thank you for this presentation full of really good information that I hope is of use to everyone on today's call. Thank you for the tips and the overview on audience and messaging, as well as the worksheets. I hope that some of the handouts, that people actually take time to work through some of those and have a chance to make use of all of the information. Thank you for today.
Yep, you're very welcome.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having us.
Okay, and just as a reminder, there is a part 2 to spokesperson training, which is, as Lisa and Courtney said, is going to take place on Thursday, August 20th. If you have not already registered for part 2, we do encourage you to register and join us on Thursday for part 2. Okay, otherwise that ends today's presentation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.